All right, I am back. Let's see. Oh, my child. Sometimes she just does not understand. It's just the way kids are. All right. So poetry in Han society appears primarily in two contexts, in sort of like poetic gatherings called utawase, and also just in ordinary conversation. These are, like I said, these are aristocrats. They don't have anything else to really occupy their time. So one of the things that they will do is they will communicate with each other in poetry, in poems, in these short poems. And to give you an example of how this works, let's take a look at, so the numbers here refer to the sort of the standard numbering of poems in the Kokinshu, and this is on page 108 of the reading I gave you guys. So I gotta scroll a bit. So this is probably the most famous poetic interchange in the history of the Japanese language between a guy named Ariwara no Narihira, who is sort of this famous like romantic figure in Japanese literary history, and an unnamed woman at the in Ise. And so we get this little sort of introductory. So this is actually part of the text of the anthology, this little introductory bit. In fact, this introductory bit will become very important later on when we talk about sort of the origins of prose fiction in Japanese. So the introduction to poem 645 says, when Narihira visited the province of Ise, he met secretly the person who was serving as the high priestess. The next morning, before he was able to find a way to send her a message, this poem was delivered from the woman. And it says here, he met secretly. So the verb that's used here, au, like, does literally mean like to go see somebody or to meet them or be with them. But it's basically a euphemism for an erotic encounter. They had sex. They had fun time. They had sexy fun time. And as a result of this encounter, the woman, the priestess at Ise, sends him this poem. Kimi ga koshwari ya yukikem omoizu. Yume ka utsu ka nete ka semete ka. Did I say semete? Samete ka, sorry. Did you come to me? Did I visit you? I cannot know. Dream, reality, was I asleep or awake? And then Narihira sends a response. So this is the reply. And we'll get more of sort of the story that surrounds this when we read the Ise Monogatari. Kakikurasu kokoro no yami ni madoi niki. Yume utsu to wa yoi to sadame yo. I'm not sure about the translation there. Yohito, let others. That's. Well, I'm not going to explain why I think this translation is a bit sus. I'll just go with what they have for the time being. I wandered too in heart-blinding darkness. Was it dream or reality? Let others decide. Yeah, that's a mistranslation. Oh, no, it's not a mistranslation. I'm forgetting the fact that in the Ise Monogatari, the reply poem is actually different. Yeah, sorry. No, this is the correct translation of the poem as it appears in the Kokinshu. Sorry. Textual problems. Anyway, so here it is. This is the actual sort of the interchange between these two people. So, so Narihira goes to this woman, they have sexy fun time, and then their conversation, as realized, is literally an exchange of poems. And in this exchange, you see something that is characteristic of the aesthetics of the period, which is a kind of, Helen Craig McCullough refers to this as elegant confusion. What is elegant confusion? It's this idea of sort of not really a kind of, did it happen? Did it not happen? I don't really know. And this serves both a sort of literary function because it creates a kind of interesting, literary effect, but it also serves a social function as well because these sorts of amorous encounters could be taken badly. In other words, the way in which men and women often engaged in sexual intercourse in this period One, oftentimes the way in which it was done was technically illegal. I don't want to get into that, but also like how you engage in a romantic affair is itself a kind of aesthetic practice. In other words, you don't just have a relationship with somebody, but you have to have a relationship with someone elegantly. You have to do it gracefully. You have to do it tactfully. And your status and your reputation is based upon your ability to do this. So the use of this like literary artifice, this sort of like graceful, like elegant expression for like, hey, did you come shag me last night? Is meant to play into that sense of like asserting your social status by understanding that you know how to play the rules of the game. And the rules of the game are that you have to kind of feign indifference or sort of like a lack of knowledge or understanding. In other words, there is a kind of game at play here, and the exchange of poems that we see here is fundamental to that game, so to speak. So that's the first major topic or set of topics that we see in the Kokinshu. The other major one is nature, particularly anything related to the four seasons. Now, the seasons are not regarded equally in Japanese culture at this time. There is far more emphasis placed on spring and autumn as sort of the transitionary periods, and because of their transitionary nature, they're thought of as having a more sort of profound emotional resonance than summer and winter, which, you know, winter is just kind of cold, is just kind of blah, and summer, which is just kind of hot and is also just kind of blah. So spring and autumn, these are really the two major seasons. But in addition to that, the various like books or sections of the Kokinshu, they have a kind of narrative thread that runs through them. And this is really easy to see in the ones that have to do with nature, because it pretty much begins at the beginning. You know, the poems begin at the beginning of the season, they move through to the end of the season. So let's take a look at that. Let's see, it's on page 94. So starting here at spring 2. So, I mean, here we're going to see pretty much the most cliched aspect of, you know, mists and cherry blossoms. Spring mists, cherry blossoms, like the two most cliched images of spring that exist in Japanese culture. And cherry blossoms in particular, it's a thing in Japan. There's cherry blossom viewing parties. It's really kind of tacky and annoying, really. At least I find it to be tacky and annoying. But they love it. So in this first anonymous poem we have here, that begins there are actually two sections on spring. The second one begins on hills. So harugasumi, so literally spring mist. On hills where mists of spring trail, glowing faintly, do the flowers' fading colors foretell their fall. So we have, and the flowers in question here are cherry blossoms, sakurabana. Literally, I don't understand why it was translated just as flowers, because it does literally say cherry flowers, cherry blossoms. So the reason why cherry blossoms are so important, actually, I'm going to add this. There is a really important aesthetic principle that doesn't really begin in this period, but it sort of becomes prominent in this period and pretty much lasts throughout. It's not aware, that's aware. So the concept is mono no aware. So literally the it's like the, I guess you could say the sadness of things. But it's an aesthetic principle in Japanese literature that has to do with sort of the an appreciation of transience. In other words, the changing of the seasons, the falling of cherry blossoms, the changing colors of leaves in the autumn. that there is a kind of beauty in impermanence, is really sort of what this aesthetic principle represents. Sort of cherry blossoms, particularly like falling cherry blossoms, or the fading color of cherry blossoms, are considered to be emblematic of this principle of mono no aware. And then as we progress through the sequence, saying stay would stop their fall. So here we have like a poet kind of thinking about, the nature of transience, trying to, appreciate the beauty of the thing as it is now, but always sort of in the back of their mind thinking about what it will become. And then another poem, a separate poem, creating kind of a dialogic effect with that one. If saying stay would stop their falling, could I hold these blossoms more dear? If I could somehow like arrest time, would they be more valuable to me? And the sort of implicit answer here is actually no. So the idea is that what makes them dear to me is it's like, so you have the lament about the fact that, things are going to fade and fall away. But then the realization that like, well, if I could just arrest time and stop it now, then their beauty would be meaningless to me. So you see a kind of narrative progression. You have sort of an idea that's posited, and then you have another one that responds to it. And then sort of in that realization, and then from that realization, okay, so it's not actually that I like them for themselves, but in the fact that they can fade, I appreciate their beauty in it. And then the following poem says, it's their falling without regret I admire. Cherry blossoms, a world of sadness if they'd stayed. Sort of completing the cap of sort of the thought that had progressed from that first poem. And what's worth noting is that these are all anonymous poems, but these are not by the same poet. There's not a person named anonymous. These are all separate, completely separate poems. But what Tsuruyuki has done is, in arranging them, he has created a kind of narrative for the poems. In other words, the emphasis here is not necessarily on the intent for which they were composed. In other words, the initial context for which they were composed is less important than the way in which Tsuruyuki himself is reading them and also intends for you to read them as well. So the arrangement, even though Tsuruyuki is just picking poems and arranging them, the arrangement itself becomes a form of composition that creates, as I said, this kind of like narrative thread that runs through them. Okay, so since I'm running a little bit long here, the last thing I want to talk about are so we have all the same rhetorical figures that we saw in the Manyoshu, so you can refer back to the lecture notes from Unit 1. We have the Joel phrases, the Joel kotoba, these sort of preface phrases. You have makura kotoba, you have pillow words, you have tsuiku, you have these sort of like A and B expressions. In fact, you actually see that sort of like A and B thing here in that first poem in the Spring 2 sequence, where on the one hand, like you see the cherry blossom, you see the mist of spring, cherry blossoms, etc. You see them as they are now, but then you also see their absence. So you're seeing the presence and absence at the same time. This idea of sort of like, this tsuiku relationship of like the thing and not necessarily its opposite, but sort of something that is juxtaposed with it. In this case, it is the opposite. It's the absence. But there are a couple new things. So first of all, you have this concept of mitate. What is mitate? Mitate is literally, so it's made up of the verbs for to see, miru, and tateru, literally to so stand something up. So like, if something has fallen over, when you pick it up and you stand it upright, that is tateru. So if you're seeing something, so you're erecting something in your vision, so to speak. What does this mean? In practice, it usually refers to seeing one thing as something that is very dissimilar to it. And this is not necessarily a metaphor. It's not saying like, it's not a similar metaphor in the way that, a moon shining, like, her pale, it's like you literally think that something appears to you to be another thing. So let's look at an example of this on page 103. Scrolling sucks. Right, which number wasn't? 290. Okay, not that one. Not that one. There we go. 290. So the gusting wind shows itself in a cloak of many colors, a scattering of autumn leaves. In other words, the poet here is seeing the autumn leaves as, you know, they've fallen from the tree and they're scattered along the ground, and the wind suddenly picks up and, you know, launches these colorful leaves into the air, and then for a moment it appears to the poet as if it were as it says, a cloak of many colors. So this idea is that you're seeing one thing as if it were another. Another important, and then I append, this isn't actually a translation of the term, but since I mentioned it earlier, this notion of elegant confusion, this is another way in which this sort of elegant confusion can manifest. Another really important rhetorical figure in poetry of this period is the so-called pivot word, or kakekotoba. What is a pivot word? So a pivot word refers to a word in a poem that can be parsed. In other words, it can be read in more than one way. And I mean that in a grammatical sense. It's a kind of like complex interlocking pun. It's technically a kind of pun, but it's a pun that, given due to the nature of the Japanese language, makes it so that you can read a poem in one of at least two ways, sometimes more than that. And so an example of this we see on page 108. Which number was it? It is 797. So this is a poem by the incredibly famous woman poet Ono no Komachi. She's mentioned down here. And this is probably one of her most famous poems in the entire collection. It's just generally, it's a poem you should know. So we're going to look at it in detail. So the way it reads in Japanese, Iromie de utsuro mono wa yo no naka no hito no kokoro no hana ni zo arikeru. And that's a really long expression. Yo no naka no hito no kokoro no hana ni zo arikeru. So this really that pivots along the fact that the verb miete or miede. It can be read either way, given the Japanese. So if you read this has to do with the fact that like the maru and the tenten that are used commonly in modern Japanese orthography are not used in pre-modern Japanese orthography. So the verb is written in kana as miete, but it can be read as miete or it can be read as miede. Depends. And Ono no Komachi probably intends both of those meanings. So the first meaning, so not changing color. So this is understanding the te is de, which is a negative. Not changing color, or color unchanging, yet fading all the same. Such is the flower of the heart of one in this world of love. So again, you see this sort of this tsuiku principle in steak, sort of this pairing of like this juxtaposition of things, in this case an unchanging color that fades. So it's weird. It's like this idea that, like, you know, the person stays the same and yet somehow their love alters. And it's not just a meditation on the nature of love and amorous relationships, but it's also in many ways a meditation on the nature of the world. The world this seems to be this thing that is constant. It's always there. It's like, you know, like the mountains, like the seas, et cetera, et cetera. And yet in its constancy is also continuously changing. And then the editors of the volume give you another possible translation, an equally plausible reading. So in this case, miete, instead of like, I actually also think this is probably understanding it as a different verb. Anyway, so all too visibly, its color fades, the flower of the heart of one passing through this world of love. So what's interesting is that literally in the word itself, it's saying like color not apparent, color apparent. Like literally like color being visible, necessarily not being visible, or not appearing, color appearing. So you have literally sort of like the expression and its opposite, but also because the poem itself is meditating on this principle of the constancy of the world, or sort of the constant, like, on one hand things seem to remain constant, and yet they're always constantly in flux. So it's perpetual, but it's perpetual motion, which seems to be an irony, but in fact isn't. And I think that's what Ono no Komachi is trying to point to, not just with what she says in the poem, but also how she says it. And this is really, 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 really important, because, and this sort of gets me to my last point, which is this one right here, which is that poets in this period aren't just trying to express, it's not just, as Tsuruyuki says in his preface, it's not just that, like, oh, I feel something and that becomes a seed, and then the seed like blooms or grows, and then it sort of becomes 10,000 word, leaves of words. So there's this idea that you have an emotion or a sensation or even an idea that you want to express, but also there is a focus in this period on a kind of technical proficiency. It's not just that you express it, it's also that you express it in such a way that is clever, that is witty, that is interesting. Because again, there's this focus on aesthetic practices as a way of life. In other words, you're not trying to cultivate yourself as a poet or a painter, or your ability to write calligraphy or any of these other like beautiful things just for some like inherent reason. You're doing it because it demonstrates to others your status as a refined, elegant individual. And so that's where I'm going to leave you guys for this week. If you're watching this video, be sure to get on top of those assignments. For those of you who still have yet to do some of your previous assignments, I haven't graded last week's test yet, and I'll just grade them as I get them done. Try to stay on top of all of your work, and as always, stay safe, stay healthy, and if you guys have any questions or concerns, show up to my office hours or the class period. Non-mandatory as always, and I hope to see at least some of you there. Okay, bye.